The lock on the dressing room door turned with a soft, deliberate click, and on the other side of it, Iselle Marivaux counted to 3 before she let her hand fall from the key. She had a few seconds to decide. The bell in the south tower had not yet struck, the corridor outside was still empty of footsteps, and the dress laid across the chaise behind her was not the one anyone in the house expected her to wear. Black silk, unadorned, cut close at the shoulder, with a hem that whispered when she lifted it from the cushion. 2 years of quiet had been folded into that hem. 2 years of being looked past at her own dinners, of being addressed through intermediaries, of standing beside a husband who had, in all that time, never once let his eyes find hers across a room. 2 years she had not been seen. And tonight, the night of the regional reception in the long gallery, she meant to be looked at, even if it cost her every careful arrangement she had built around her name. She lifted the dress. It was lighter than she had expected. She had braced for the weight of a decision and found instead the soft sigh of fabric. There was, in that small surprise, the beginning of something she did not yet have a word for. The maid had been dismissed an hour earlier with a kind lie about a headache, and Iselle had bolted the inner door herself, an act so small and so unfamiliar that it felt almost theatrical. She slipped out of the pale gown her mother-in-law had chosen, the one stitched with the family's discreet emblem at the collar, the one that had hung in the wardrobe like a polite instruction, and she folded it without ceremony over the back of a chair. She stepped into the black silk. She breathed. The mirror gave her back to herself in a way she had not been given back in some time. She looked at the woman in the glass and did not look away. The bell began to ring then, low and full, and she counted the strokes as she fastened the small jet button at her throat. 1 for the gallery doors opening, 2 for the gentleman entering, 3 for the wine being poured, 4 for her absence, beginning to be noticed, 5 for the moment her husband would be told, by someone with a careful voice, that the Lady Marivaux had not yet come down. She had until the 8th stroke to descend the back stair. She picked up her gloves. She did not pick up the small string of pearls that had been laid out beside them. Out in the corridor the air was colder than she had thought it would be, and the lamps had been trimmed low because the steward economized in places no guest would see. She knew every uneven board in this house. She had walked them in slippers at midnight when she could not sleep, and in riding boots at dawn when she could, and she knew which of them sighed and which of them held their tongues. She took the silent ones. She heard from below the soft growing murmur of a gathering already in motion, a sound like a river settling into its bed. She heard a laugh she recognized as belonging to the dowager, brief and bright as a coin dropped on marble. She heard, threaded through it all, the lower register of a voice she had spent 2 years not quite listening to and not quite ignoring. Her husband, Aurel Marivaux, was speaking with someone near the foot of the stairs. He did not know she was above him. He had not known where she was for most of 2 years. The arrangement, after all, had been an arrangement. It had been signed at a long table in his uncle's study, with 2 lawyers nodding gravely at a clause about the eastern vineyards, and it had been blessed in a small chapel by a priest who had clearly performed the rite often enough to do it from memory. There had been no scandal. There had been no romance. There had been a settlement, and a date, and a carriage, and a house, and a husband who, from the very first afternoon, had looked somewhere just past her left shoulder whenever he addressed her. She had told herself, that first month, that he was shy. She had told herself, the second month, that he was preoccupied. By the 6th month, she had stopped telling herself anything at all, because the stories were beginning to hurt more than the silence. The silence she could manage. The silence, in fact, she had learned to use. She paused at the turn of the back stair, where the wall opened into a narrow window, and she looked out across the courtyard. A single lantern hung above the gate, and beneath it a boy was holding the bridle of a horse she did not recognize. Someone, then, had come, who was not expected. She filed the information away with the same neat motion she filed everything, and she went down. The long gallery had been opened end to end for the reception, and the candles in the iron sconces had been lit in such number that the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Iselle paused in the small antechamber where the family portraits hung, a place no guest lingered because the dowager had insisted on hanging her own ancestors there in a row of unsmiling oils. From the antechamber she could see, through the half-open door, the bright interior of the gallery, and she could see her husband standing near the center of it with his hands clasped lightly behind his back and his head bent in conversation with a tall man in a traveling coat. The traveling coat was dusty at the hem. The horse at the gate, then. She studied her husband for the length of a slow breath. He was, as ever, immaculate in the way of men who have been dressed by others since childhood. His dark coat buttoned to the throat, his hair brushed back from a face that gave very little away. He had a habit of standing perfectly still while he listened, as if any motion would interrupt what was being said to him, and it was this stillness that had once, very briefly, made her think he might be a man who could be known. She had been wrong about that, or she had been impatient, or both. She let the door breathe a little wider and stepped through. The gallery did not, at first, notice her. The musicians in the alcove had begun a low piece without dancing, the sort of thing that filled the air without asking anything of it, and the guests near the doors were occupied with one another. She walked the length of the carpet without hurry. She had learned long ago that hurry invited remark. A footman near the punch table saw her first, and his eyes widened by perhaps half a degree, which, on a face trained in service, was the equivalent of a gasp. He recovered, bowed, and offered her a glass she did not take. The second to see her was the dowager, who was seated at the far end of the gallery in the carved chair she preferred, and who used a small jeweled glass to inspect anyone within range. The dowager's lips parted, then closed, then parted again. Iselle inclined her head with perfect politeness and kept walking. She did not look at her husband. She walked past him. The dowager rose from her chair, which she did not often do unaided, and made her way along the wall with a quickness that suggested she had decided to intercept. Iselle reached the small group near the windows, 2 elderly cousins and the wife of a magistrate, and greeted them by name. They greeted her back, and then there was a small, uncertain pause, as each of them in turn took in the dress. The magistrate's wife, who was kind and had no talent for pretense, said, very softly, "Oh, my dear, are you in mourning?" And Iselle smiled the smile she had perfected and said, "Only for an idea." The magistrate's wife did not know what to do with this, and laughed a small laugh that was 3 parts confusion and 1 part admiration, and the elderly cousins exchanged a glance that would be discussed in carriages on the way home. The dowager arrived. She did not greet her daughter-in-law. She said, in a voice meant to be heard by precisely those within 3 paces, "This is not the gown we discussed." Iselle turned to her and said, "No, it is not," with a clarity that surprised even her. She had expected, when she had imagined this moment in the dressing room, that her voice would tremble. It did not. It came out even and low, the way a bell sounds when it has been struck cleanly. The dowager's mouth tightened. She looked for a brief instant, almost interested. Then the formal mask slid back into place, and she said, "We will speak later," and turned to greet a viscount who had not asked to be greeted. Iselle let the silence hold. She did not fill it. Across the gallery, somewhere behind her, she felt the change. It was not a sound. It was not even a motion she could name. It was the kind of shift one feels in a room when a draft has been let in from somewhere unexpected. A small alteration of the air. She did not turn. She would not turn. She accepted a glass from the footman this time and lifted it to her lips and tasted nothing. She had a few seconds to decide. Again. And again she counted to 3 before she allowed herself to look. She looked at her husband, and her husband was looking at her. He had stopped speaking mid-sentence. The tall man in the traveling coat had noticed, and had glanced from him to her and back again with the careful neutrality of a man whose profession had taught him not to remark on anything until paid to. Aurel Marivaux did not seem to be aware that he had stopped speaking. His hands were still clasped behind his back. His head was no longer bent. His eyes, which Iselle had only ever truly seen in profile and at angles, were now fixed on her in a way that made her understand, with a quiet shock, that she had never actually been seen by him before. Not on the day of their signing, not on the day of the chapel, not on any of the 723 mornings since. She had been spoken near, dined opposite, ridden beside, but she had not been looked at. She was being looked at now. She held the glass very still. The musicians in the alcove finished one slow figure and began another. The dowager, sensing something she did not understand, lifted her jeweled lens and turned in her chair, And for the first time in Isel's 2 years in the house, the dowager's lens did not find what it was hunting for, because Oral had taken 3 steps toward his wife without quite seeming to know he was moving. He stopped at a distance that was, by any measure of the room, improper. He said her name. He said it the way a man says a word he has only ever read before, as if testing the shape of it in his mouth, as if he had been told the pronunciation by someone who had not been entirely sure. Isel. She did not answer at once. She looked at him steadily, and she let him see her looking. Then she said evenly, "You have not used my name in this house since the night we arrived." He did not flinch. He said, "I know." There was a small pause in which the gallery, by some collective instinct of the well-bred, decided to look elsewhere. The cousins drifted toward the punch. The magistrate's wife discovered a sudden interest in a portrait. The dowager, frustrated to be unable to intervene without drawing attention to what she did not want noticed, sat back in her chair and tapped one knuckle against the carved arm. Aurel said, more quietly, "May we step out a moment?" Isel considered him. The traveling coat had withdrawn to the punch table with admirable speed. The candles flickered as a door opened somewhere down the gallery. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the courtyard lantern swung gently in a wind that had risen since she came down. She said after a moment, "The orangery is open." He inclined his head. He did not offer her his arm, and she was grateful for it, because if he had touched her at that moment, she did not know what she would have done. They walked the length of the gallery together without touching, and the air between them was the air of 2 strangers who have been told, by an authority neither of them respects, that they are bound. The orangery lay at the gallery's eastern end, through a pair of glass doors. It smelled of citrus leaves and damp brick, and the faint trace of pipe smoke from someone who had stolen out earlier and stood by the fountain. The lanterns there had been dimmed to almost nothing. The plants made a soft wall of green between them and the gallery, and the small fountain in the center made a sound like rain falling at a great distance. Oral closed the glass doors behind them. He did not turn at once. He stood with his hands still resting on the brass handle as if he were uncertain whether to step forward into what came next or to retreat into what had been. She watched his shoulders. They were very still. She knew that stillness. She had read it for 2 years. She had read it as indifference, as boredom, as a quiet contempt she had never understood the cause of. She was beginning to read it differently now, and she was not yet sure she trusted the new reading. He turned. The lantern light caught the side of his face and showed her for the first time the small lines at the corner of his eye, the faint shadow under it, a tiredness she had not been permitted to notice before. He said, "The dress." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "I want to explain." She set her glass down on the rim of the fountain. The water took a small bright drop of it and carried it away. She said, "Then explain." He looked at the floor of the orangery for what felt like a long time. He was choosing the order of his words with the care of a man diffusing something. He said, "My brother." She did not move. She had been told there had been a brother. She had been told nothing else. The dowager kept no portrait of him. The steward did not speak of him. There was a room on the upper floor whose door was always locked, and Isel had assumed, with the polite incuriosity she had cultivated, that it was simply a room no one wished to use. Aurel said, "My brother was to have married you." He said the contract had been drawn in his name. He said he died 11 days before the date that had been set. He said my mother decided that the alliance could not be broken without ruin, and the families agreed, and I was substituted for him. He said, I did not learn of any of it until 2 days before the signing. He said, when I came to the table, I came as a man stepping into another man's place. He looked up. He said, and I could not bring myself to look at you, because I was afraid that if I did, you would see, written across my face, the fact that I was not the man you had agreed to. She was very quiet for a long moment after he stopped. The fountain went on with its distant, small rain. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, a footman dropped a tray and recovered it without breakage, and the brief metallic alarm of it ran along the orangery floor like a startled animal. She did not look away from him. She said, At last you have let me believe for 2 years that I had offended you. He closed his eyes briefly. He said, I know. She said, You have let your mother speak to me, and through me, and around me, as though I were a piece of furniture she had been obliged to accept with the rest of the dowry. He said, I know. She said, "You sat across from me at table 4 times a week and looked at the carafe rather than at my face." He said, "I counted them." She did not know what to do with that. She had imagined many possibilities in 2 years. She had imagined that he was in love elsewhere. She had imagined that he had been pressed into the marriage by debt. She had imagined that he found her ugly or dull or beneath him, or simply not worth the effort of noticing. She had not imagined that he had been afraid of her. The word arranged itself in her mind without her permission, and she set it carefully down beside the dress she was wearing, and the locked room upstairs, and the silence at the foot of every staircase. And the picture they made together was so different from the one she had been carrying that for a moment she could not speak. She said finally, "Why tonight?" He almost smiled. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a man who has just been outflanked and finds to his surprise that he is not sorry. He said, "Because tonight you wore a dress that made it impossible for me to look at anything else." He said, "I have spent 2 years not looking at you because I was afraid of what I would feel." He said, "I came down the stairs tonight and a man I do not know was telling me about a horse, and I looked across the gallery, and there you were in black, and I forgot the horse and the man and my own name, and I understood, in a way I should have understood at the table 2 years ago, that I had been a coward." She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. She turned away from him and walked the few steps to the nearest lemon tree, and laid her fingertips on a single waxy leaf, and the leaf was cool and unsurprised by her touch. She said with her back to him, "The locked room upstairs," he said, was his. She said, "You have not opened it." He said, "I have not been able to." She said, "Your mother." He said, "My mother has done what my mother does. She has decided that grief is unbecoming and has therefore declined to permit it in the house. She has folded my brother into a silence and labeled the silence good manners. I have, until tonight, allowed her to do it, because the alternative was to feel what I have been refusing to feel, and I did not believe I had the strength." She turned then. She looked at him across the small distance of the orangery and the small distance of 2 years, and she said, "And what do you believe now?" He said, "I believe I owe you an apology that cannot be made in a single conversation." He said, "I believe I owe my brother a door that is finally opened." He said, "I believe I owe myself, and you, the chance to find out whether what was signed at a table 2 years ago can become something neither of us was promised." She did not answer at once. She was not ready to answer. She was aware, beneath the careful structure of her composure, of a small bright thing moving in her chest that she did not yet have permission to name. She said, "You understand that I cannot simply forgive you tonight." He said, "I do not ask you to." She said, "You understand that I have built a life inside your silence, and that I am not certain I wish to dismantle it on the strength of one evening." He said, "I do not ask you to dismantle anything." She said, "Then what do you ask?" He said, "I ask you to let me look at you. I ask you to let me, from tomorrow, walk into a room where you are and meet your eyes. I ask you, if you can bear it, to let me learn your name as a man learns the name of someone he is choosing, rather than someone he was handed." She considered him for a long time. In the gallery beyond the doors, the musicians had begun a slow figure that suggested the company would soon be moving toward the supper room. The dowager would be looking for them. The traveling coat would be wondering where his host had gone. The boy at the gate would be walking the unfamiliar horse along the cobbles to keep it from cooling too quickly. The world was, as ever, full of small, ongoing demands. She said, "You may look at me." She said, "And tomorrow, you may say my name at breakfast, and I will answer." She said, "And the day after, we will open the door upstairs together, because that grief belongs to this house, and this house belongs to both of us, and I will not have a room in my own home that I am not permitted to enter." He bowed his head. It was not the formal bow of a husband to a wife in public. It was the small private bow of a man who has just been granted something he had not dared to ask for in plain words. He said, "Thank you." She picked up her glass from the fountain rim. The water released the small, bright drop of reflection back to her. She walked past him toward the doors, and as she passed, she let the back of her hand brush, very briefly, against the back of his. It was the first time, in 2 years, that they had touched without ceremony. Neither of them spoke of it. They went back into the gallery together. The supper that followed was, by every visible measure, the same supper the house always gave. The long table had been laid with the second-best service, because the dowager believed the best service was wasted on regional guests. And the soup was the clear consommé the cook produced when she wished to remind the household that she had been trained in the capital. The candles were trimmed at the correct intervals. The footmen moved with the choreography of long practice. The conversation at the head of the table was about the price of timber and the new road that had been promised by an official whom none of them believed. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. To Iselle, seated in the place she had occupied for 2 years, everything had. She was aware of her husband at the other end of the long table in a way she had never been aware of him before. She did not stare. She did not need to. She knew without checking that when she lifted her glass, he watched her lift it. She knew that when she turned to answer the elderly cousin on her left, he turned a fraction of a degree in his chair so that he could see her face. She knew that when she laughed, briefly and quietly, at a small dry remark made by the magistrate's wife about a neighbor's hat, he heard the laugh and held it for a moment before letting it go. She had spent 2 years feeling unseen at this table. She was being seen now, the length of the linen, between the candles, across the small silver birds the dowager had insisted on placing as centerpieces because they had belonged to her own mother. The dowager, for her part, had noticed. The dowager noticed everything, and what she could not name she resented. She sat very straight in her chair and conducted the conversation with the particular brittleness of a woman who senses that the room has shifted under her without her consent. She made a small pointed comment about the unsuitability of dark gowns for occasions of welcome, and the magistrate's wife, who was not as harmless as her face suggested, observed mildly that she had always thought dark gowns suited certain complexions remarkably well, and the dowager declined to comment further. The viscount at her right, who was a kind old man easily bored, said something about a horse he had bought in the spring, and the dowager allowed herself to be diverted because she preferred horses to whatever was happening at the other end of the table. Iselle ate very little. She had, she discovered, no appetite for the soup, nor for the small fish that followed it, nor for the pheasant after that. She drank water. She listened to the elderly cousin on her left tell a long story about a grandchild who had learned to ride, and she made the appropriate small sounds at the appropriate small intervals, and inside her chest, the bright thing she had noticed in the orangery was still moving. After the pheasant, the dowager rose, which was the signal that the ladies would withdraw to the small drawing room, and the gentlemen would remain for port. The chairs scraped. The footman stepped back. Arl rose with the rest. As Iselle passed his end of the table on her way to the door, he turned his head and looked at her, plainly, openly, without ducking the look or sliding it past her shoulder. She inclined her head to him. He inclined his head in return. It was, by any standard, the dowager would have approved perfectly correct behavior between a husband and a wife at a formal supper. It was also, in the private arithmetic of 2 people who had not exchanged a direct look in 723 mornings, an event of considerable magnitude. The drawing room, when the ladies reached it, was warmer than the gallery, because a small fire had been lit against the evening chill. Iselle took the seat near the window, which the dowager always reserved for herself, and which the dowager could not, on this evening, claim without rudeness, because Iselle had reached it first. The dowager noticed. She seated herself in the second-best chair and arranged her skirts with the precision of a woman who intends to make a point by saying nothing for at least 3 minutes. The magistrate's wife, who was deeply enjoying herself, asked Iselle very kindly about the gardens, and Iselle answered with a small, clear description of what had been planted along the south wall, and the conversation, against all of the dowager's preferences, took a pleasant and quite ordinary turn. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, when the ladies had begun to settle into their cups of tisane, and the elderly cousins had begun the slow drift toward gentle reminiscence, the door opened, and the gentlemen came in. They came earlier than the dowager had expected, and she looked up sharply, because she had built her schedule around half an hour of port. The viscount came first, smiling about something. The traveling coat, who had been introduced over supper as a land agent from the Eastern District, came next, looking, Iselle thought, slightly relieved. Arl came last. He did not pause in the doorway. He crossed the small drawing room without speaking to anyone, and he came to the window where Iselle sat, and he asked her, in a voice that the room could perfectly well hear, and that he did not trouble to lower, whether she would walk with him in the courtyard for a moment, because the air in the house had grown close. The dowager's mouth opened. The dowager's mouth closed. The magistrate's wife pretended, with great dignity, to be entirely absorbed in her tisane. Iselle stood. She said, of course, and she took the arm her husband offered, and they went out together through the side door into the courtyard, where the lantern still swung over the gate, and the unfamiliar horse had been led away to the stable. The courtyard was cold, and the stars were thin and bright above the roofline, and somewhere in the kitchen wing a door opened and closed, and a woman laughed at something a man had said. Iselle drew the air into her lungs and held it. Aurel said, "My mother will be furious." Iselle said, "Yes." He said, "I find I do not at present care." She glanced sideways at him. He was looking up at the stars with the faintly bewildered expression of a man who has been indoors too long. She said, "That is new." He said, "A great many things, tonight, are new." They walked the length of the courtyard once, in silence, and then a second time, more slowly. The cobbles were uneven under her thin slippers, and she found, with a private small amusement, that she did not mind. She had walked these cobbles in boots 100 times. She had not walked them in slippers, on her husband's arm, ever. Aurel said, "After the second turn, may I ask you something?" She said, "You may ask." He said, "The dress. Where did it come from?" She said, "It has been in the bottom of my trunk since I came to this house." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Then you brought it with you?" She said, "I did." He said, "Why?" She considered her answer. She said, "Because my aunt who raised me, who was a practical woman and not given to sentiment, told me on the morning of my departure that every woman ought to keep one good black dress in the bottom of her trunk, because there would come a day in any marriage when she would need it, and on that day she would not have time to have one made." He almost laughed. It was a quiet sound, more breath than voice. He said, "Your aunt sounds formidable." She said, "She was." He said, "Did she think you would need it for mourning?" She said, "She did not specify." They walked a few more paces. The lantern at the gate threw their joined shadows against the wall, and the shadows were long and a little uncertain, like two people who have not yet practiced walking in step. Aurel said, "The land agent who came tonight." She said, "The traveling coat." He glanced at her. He said, "Yes, the traveling coat." She said, "What of him?" He said, "He came with news from the Eastern estate that I have been refusing for 2 years to address. He came because the steward there finally wrote to him directly, over my head, and asked him to ride out and tell me in person that the vineyards I inherited from my brother are failing because no one has made a decision about them in 2 years. He said, my brother loved those vineyards. He spent every autumn there. He knew every row. When he died, I could not bring myself to go, and I could not bring myself to sell, and I could not bring myself even to read the steward's reports. And so the vines have done what vines do when they are not attended. They have begun to fail." She listened. She did not interrupt. He said, "The agent told me, over supper, that if a decision is not made before the end of this season, the loss will not be recoverable." He told me this in a low voice between the soup and the fish, and I sat there with a spoon in my hand, and I understood that I have been allowing a thing my brother loved to die because I could not bear to touch it. He stopped walking. He looked at her. He said, "I have been doing the same with you." She did not answer at once. She had not expected, on this night of all nights, to be compared to a vineyard, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not offended. There was a clarity in the comparison that pleased some practical part of her, the part her aunt had trained. She said, "Then we will go to the Eastern estate." He said, "We." She said, "Yes, we. If the vines belong to your brother, and your brother was to have been my husband, then the vines are, in some sense, mine to attend as well. And if you have not been able to face them alone, perhaps you do not have to." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You would do that." She said, "I would do that on one condition." He waited. She said, that we open the room upstairs first." He nodded slowly. He said, "Yes." They walked back toward the side door together. As they reached it, a small figure detached itself from the shadow of the kitchen wing and stepped into the lantern light, and Iselle recognized the cook's youngest grandchild, a girl of perhaps 7, who had been told 100 times not to be out in the courtyard at this hour, and who was, as ever, out in the courtyard at this hour. The child stopped when she saw them, and her eyes went very wide, and she made a small, clumsy curtsy that nearly landed her on the cobbles. Iselle smiled at her. She said, gently, "You are out late." The child said, in a whisper, "I came to see the lady in the black dress." Iselle crouched down, careful of the silk, until her face was level with the child's. She said, "And what do you think?" The child considered her with the grave attention only a small child can give. The child said, "Finally, you look like the queen in the story about the winter." Iselle did not know what story this was. She suspected the cook had been inventing it on slow afternoons. She said, "Thank you. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me tonight." The child, emboldened, said, "Are you sad?" Iselle thought about the question. She said, "I was." The child said, "Are you still?" Iselle stood up. She looked at her husband, who was watching the child with an expression she had not seen on his face before, a softness that sat oddly on his careful mouth. She said, "I do not think I am still, not in the way I was." The child seemed satisfied with this answer, and turned, and ran back into the shadow of the kitchen wing, and a moment later they heard a door open, and a low scolding voice and the door closing again. Aurel said, quietly, "You were kind to her." Iselle said, "She was kind to me." They went back inside. The room upstairs had a key that lived in the dowager's writing desk, in the second drawer, under a small leather case of visiting cards. The dowager did not know that Iselle knew this. Iselle had discovered it during her first month in the house, when she had been looking for a sheet of writing paper and had instead found the key, lying alone in a velvet groove that had been made for it, with the air of an object that had been placed there to be forgotten. She had closed the drawer without touching the key, and she had never spoken of it, because she had learned very early that knowledge in this house was best held quietly until it was needed. It was needed now. She fetched it the next morning while the dowager was still at her chocolate. The corridor on the upper floor was narrow and cold, and the door to the locked room was at the end of it, painted the same pale color as the others, with a small brass plate bearing a number rather than a name. Aurel was waiting for her there. He had not slept much, she could see. The shadow under his eye had deepened. He was holding in his hand a small, folded square of cloth that she did not at first recognize, and then did. It was a handkerchief, edged in plain hem, embroidered at one corner with 2 initials she did not know. He saw her notice it. He said, "His." She nodded. She did not ask why he had kept it folded in his pocket overnight or how long he had carried it before that, because she understood, with the new clarity that had been growing in her since the orangery, that some questions were not yet hers to ask. She put the key in the lock. The lock turned with the unwilling stiffness of a mechanism that has not been used in a long time. The door swung inward. The room was not, as she had half expected, a shrine. It was simply a room. There was a bed, neatly made, with a coverlet pulled smooth as if for an inspection. There was a writing desk by the window. There was a chair beside the desk, pushed in. There was a bookcase along one wall, half full of books and half full of the small useful objects of a working life. A tin of nibs, a stack of unlabeled notebooks, a brass instrument of a kind Iselle did not recognize. 2 flat stones of the sort one picks up on a riverbank and forgets to leave behind. There was a coat on a hook behind the door, dark green, with the elbows worn shiny. The air smelled of dust and faintly of wax. There were no portraits. There were no flowers. There was no inscription. There was only the room of a man who had stepped out of it one morning, expecting to step back in. Aurel stood in the doorway. He did not enter at once. Iselle went in. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything. She paused at the desk. There was a notebook lying open on it, as if someone had been called away mid-sentence. The sentence was unfinished. The ink had dried 2 years ago in the middle of a word. She read what was there. It was a note about the Eastern Vineyard, written in a steady hand, observing that the third row from the south wall was producing more than the others and speculating, in a tone of quiet pleasure, about why. She closed the notebook gently. She turned to her husband. She said, "Come in." He came in. He stood in the middle of the room with his arms at his sides, and he looked, slowly, at each thing in it. He looked at the bed. He looked at the desk. He looked at the coat on the hook. He looked at the brass instrument and at the 2 riverbank stones. He did not weep. She had thought perhaps that he would, and she had prepared herself to let him do it without comment. He did not. He simply looked, and as he looked, the careful stillness she had read for 2 years, as indifference began, by small degrees, to undo itself. His shoulders, which had been set since the moment she had met him, lowered by perhaps half an inch. His hands, which had been clasped, loosened. His mouth, which had held a small fixed line, softened into something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but was, recognizably, the face of a living man rather than a managed one. He said, finally, the third row. She said, yes. He said, he was always going on about the third row. She did not know what to say. She said, the notebook was open to it. He went to the desk. He laid his hand on the closed notebook. He stood there for a long time. He said quietly, I think I should like to take this with me when we go east. She said, yes. They did not stay long in the room. There would be other days for that. Isel locked the door behind them when they left, and she did not return the key to the dowager's desk. She kept it. She placed it, that afternoon, on her own dressing table beside the small jet button she had unfastened from her throat the night before, and she let it lie there in plain sight, because she had decided that there would be no more hidden keys in this house. The dowager noticed within the day. The dowager said nothing. The dowager said nothing for a number of days afterward. In fact, on a number of subjects, on which she had previously had a great deal to say, and Isel understood that something in the order of the house had shifted, and that the dowager, who was no fool, had decided to spend a few weeks observing before she chose her next move. They went east a fortnight later. The journey took 3 days, because the new road that had been promised had not been built, and the old road was slow, and Oral had insisted that they should not hurry. They traveled in a plain carriage rather than the formal one, with a single trunk strapped behind, and Isel wore, on the first day, a traveling dress of dark green that had once belonged to no one in particular, and she felt, as they passed beyond the boundary of the home estate, the curious lightness of a person who has crossed an invisible line. The country to the east was different. The hills were lower and the light was thinner and the villages were spaced more widely. They stopped, on the second night, at an inn that had clearly been a coaching stop in better days, and was now a comfortable, slightly faded place run by a woman who recognized the family name and asked, with great delicacy, whether they would prefer the front room or the back. Oral said the back, because it was quieter. They ate supper in a small parlor with a fire that smoked a little. They spoke that night of things they had not yet spoken of Isel's aunt, who had raised her after her mother's death and had taught her to read accounts, of Oral's brother, whose name had been Theodore, and who had laughed often and loudly and had been, by his younger brother's report, a man impossible to dislike. They spoke of the dowager with the gentle frankness of 2 people who have agreed to be allies. They did not speak, that night, of love. Isel was grateful. She did not yet know what she would have said if he had used the word. She knew only that she liked the way he listened, and the way he had begun, in small, unguarded moments, to laugh, and the way he had taken to using her name as if it had been given to him as a gift, rather than as part of a contract. They reached the eastern estate on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The steward, a thin, grave man with sun-darkened hands, met them at the gate and could not at first speak, because he had not believed, until he saw the carriage, that they would actually come. He recovered. He showed them the house, which was smaller than the home estate and warmer in feeling. He showed them the vines. The vines were in poor condition. The 3rd row from the south wall, however, was still producing, stubbornly, as if it were determined to outlast its own neglect. Oral stood at the end of that row for a long time. Isel stood beside him. She did not speak. She had learned by now when not to. He said, "At last, We will save what can be saved. We will replant what cannot. The steward, behind them, exhaled in a way that suggested he had been holding that breath for 2 years. They stayed at the Eastern Estate for the rest of that season. Iselle learned the names of the rows. She learned the names of the men and women who worked them. She learned, with the help of a thick ledger and her aunt's old training, how the accounts of a small vineyard differed from the accounts of a large household. And she made small, careful improvements that the steward, after his initial alarm, came to be glad of. Arl walked the rows every morning. He opened his brother's notebook on the desk in the small office and read a few pages each evening, and sometimes he laughed at something his brother had written, and sometimes he sat for a long time with his hand resting on the page and did not turn it. The locked door inside him had not been opened in a single afternoon. It was being opened, slowly, the way a heavy door is opened by a person who is not yet sure what they will find on the other side. Iselle did not press him. She had decided, in the orangery, that she would not ask him to dismantle anything he was not ready to dismantle. She had also decided that she would not pretend, for his comfort or anyone else's, that the 2 years of silence had not happened. She spoke of them when they were relevant. She did not punish him with them. He, in turn, did not pretend that he had not been the author of them. They walked in this way into a shape of marriage that neither of them had been promised, and that neither of them had quite expected to want. The dowager wrote often. Her letters were models of their kind, full of small, pointed observations about the weather and the neighbors, and the unfortunate decline of standards in the younger generation. Each observation barbed in such a way that any reply would seem either rude or weak. Iselle answered each letter in her own hand, with great courtesy and with no defensiveness, reporting on the vineyard, the weather in the east, and the health of the household, and declining, gently, to engage with the barbs. After the 4th such exchange, the dowager's letters began to shorten. After the 7th, they began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. By the 10th, the dowager inquired, with what passed in her for warmth, whether Iselle thought the Eastern Estate would receive guests in the spring. Iselle showed the letter to Aurel over breakfast. He read it twice. He said, "She is asking to be invited." Iselle said, "Yes." He said, "Will you invite her?" Iselle considered. She said, "I will, but on terms." He said, "What terms?" She said that she comes as a guest in our house and not as the mistress of it. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, the small private smile she had begun, in the months at the Eastern Estate, to think of as belonging to her. He said, "You have grown, in this country, into a person I would not have dared to imagine." She said mildly, "I have not grown, I have unfolded." He thought about that. He said, "Yes, that is the better word." The dowager came in the spring. She arrived in the formal carriage, with 2 maids and an alarming quantity of luggage, and she descended into the courtyard of the Eastern Estate with the air of a queen visiting a minor province. She was met by her son and her daughter-in-law together, standing side by side, and she was shown to a guest room that had been prepared for her with great care and no ostentation. She inspected it without comment. At supper that evening, she sat at Iselle's right hand, which was the place of honor in the smaller dining room, and she remarked, almost in passing, that the soup was very good. The cook of the Eastern Estate, who had been warned in advance about the dowager's tastes, sent up a small private note of triumph with the 2nd course. The dowager stayed a month. She did not, in that month, become a different woman. She remained, in many small ways, the woman she had always been. But she watched, and she listened, and on the last evening of her visit, as Iselle was helping her settle a shawl about her shoulders against the spring chill, she said, very quietly, "I did not know that my son could laugh as he laughs now." Iselle did not answer. She did not need to. The dowager said, almost to herself, "I am glad of it." It was as near to an apology as the dowager was capable of, and Iselle, who had decided long ago not to require apologies she would not receive, accepted it as such. The dowager went home the next morning. She wrote a week later to say that she had decided to spend the rest of the season at the home estate and that she would, with their permission, come east again in the autumn for the harvest. Arl said, when he read this aloud, "Do we give permission?" Iselle said, "We do." The harvest, when it came, was small but real. The 3rd row from the south wall produced as it had always produced. The replanted rows would not bear for several years, but they had taken root, and the steward, who had grown almost cheerful, predicted a respectable yield within 3 seasons. On the evening of the last day of picking, the household gathered in the courtyard for the small supper that was the Eastern custom, and Iselle wore, because she had decided to, the black silk dress. It had been let out at the shoulder and taken in at the waist, because a year of country food and country walking had altered her, and the alterations had been done by a seamstress in the village who had not asked any questions. The dress caught the lantern light differently in the courtyard of the Eastern estate than it had in the long gallery a year before. It looked here less like a declaration and more like a familiar garment a woman wears for an occasion that matters to her. The pickers, who had been told nothing of its history, admired it without ceremony. The dowager, who had arrived 2 days earlier for the harvest as promised, looked at it across the courtyard and inclined her head, very slightly, in a way that Iselle understood to mean a number of things, none of which the dowager would ever say aloud. Aurel came to stand beside his wife near the fountain, which in this courtyard was not stone but a simple iron pump with a tin cup chained to it. He said, "Do you remember?" She said, "I remember." He said, "I have, since that night, looked at you every day." She said, "I have noticed." He said, "I intend to go on doing it." She said, "Please do." They stood there for a while in the easy silence that had grown up between them, and the pickers laughed at something at the long table, and the dowager accepted a glass of the new wine with the grave dignity of a woman performing a sacred duty. And somewhere in the warm dark beyond the lantern light a small dog barked once and was answered by another. Iselle thought, without surprise, that she was happy. She thought it broke quietly in her chest, the way good news arrives in a house that has been waiting for it. She did not say so. She did not need to. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her for a year. He would, she understood now, go on looking. Of the others, briefly, as the story winds toward its hearth, the dowager softened by degrees, never fully but enough, and lived out her years dividing her time between the 2 estates, scolding the cook at one and the steward at the other with such impartial vigor that both grew fond of her in spite of themselves. The traveling coat, the land agent, was retained by the family, and became, over time, a friend, and was eventually godfather to a child whose name does not concern us here. The cook's youngest grandchild, the small girl in the courtyard, grew into a tall, serious young woman who took service in Iselle's own household and was taught by Iselle herself to read, and who claimed all her life that the lady she served had once been a queen in a story about the winter, and was never quite persuaded otherwise. The magistrate's wife dined out for years on the tale of the black dress and improved it each time. The locked room at the home estate was not locked again. It became, at Iselle's quiet suggestion, a small library, with the brass instrument on the desk and the 2 riverbank stones as paperweights. And the dark green coat was given, after some thought, to a young man on the Eastern estate who needed one and whose shoulders were the right shape. The notebook lived on Aurel's own writing desk after that, and was added to, in his hand, year by year, until the 2 hands together filled it. And now, friend by the fire, let me ask you this, gently. Have you ever sat across a table from someone for longer than you should have, believing yourself unseen, while the truth was only that the other person did not yet know how to look? Have you ever kept a good black dress, or its equivalent, folded at the bottom of a trunk against a day you could not name, and felt, when the day came, the small, grateful weight of your own foresight? Have you ever opened a door you had been afraid to open, and found on the other side not the thing you feared, but only a room, and in the room a chair, and in the chair the shape of a life waiting patiently to be sat back down in? If any of this has been true for you, even once, then you and Iselle have walked a little of the same road, and you will know why she did not need to speak when she stood by the iron pump in the courtyard with her husband at her side. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the click of the lock in the dressing room when she chose the dress? Was it the orangery and the fountain and the word brother spoken at last? Was it the small grave child who thought she was a queen in the winter, or the 3rd row from the south wall, stubborn and producing against all neglect, or the dowager's quiet, almost grudging gladness on the last evening of her first visit east? Whichever it was, carry it with you a little while. Set another log on the fire, if you have one, and let the room grow warm around you, and when you are ready, come back and sit with me again, because there is always another story waiting on this hearth, and I would be glad of your company when it begins. Sleep well, friend. Rest easy. The next tale is already gathering itself in the embers, and I will keep your seat warm until you return.